Los Angeles, 1985. A woman sits in a chair in her living room. She is 77 years old. Her hands are shaking, but not from age. She has just been handed a copy of a book. The cover has her daughter's name on it, and the title. She reads the first few pages. Then she puts it down. She did not finish it that day. Maybe she never does. The book is called My Mother's Keeper. The author is B.D. Hyman, and the subject, described in detail across more than 300 pages, is Bette Davis herself. What was in that book, why it was written, and what it destroyed is the story we are telling today.
Stop. Don't scroll past this. What you're about to watch has been buried for centuries. Lost, forgotten, hidden in plain sight. Most people walk past these walls every day and feel nothing. But you clicked. Which means somewhere deep inside you, you already knew there was more to the story. And there is. Every crack, every stone, every shadow on these ancient walls whispers a secret the history books never told you. Welcome to Ancient Walls, where the past doesn't just speak, it screams. Now, sit back. Turn up your volume, because what comes next will change the way you see the world forever.
Chapter 1. The Legend and the Daughter Who Would Break It. Bette Davis had 2 Oscars, 18 Academy Award nominations, and a face that every director in Hollywood either wanted or feared. She was the woman who made the studio system blink, the woman who sued Warner Brothers in 1936 and lost in court but won in reputation. The woman who was called the 5th Beatle of acting by people who meant it as a compliment. She said in interviews, more than once, that her daughter was the best thing she had ever done, that being a mother was the one role that mattered more than any other. She said it on talk shows. She said it in print. And yet there was one child, a daughter who had been there for almost all of it, who saw something very different. One daughter who decided, at the age of 38, to write it all down. And one relationship that could not survive what came after. This is a story about 2 women. One of them is the most famous actress who ever lived. The other is her daughter. And the gap between those 2 sentences is where the real story sits. To understand what B.D. Hyman wrote, you have to understand the world she was born into. Not the world of Bette Davis, the legend. The world of Bette Davis, the mother. The woman who came home from the set. The woman who made dinner, or didn't. The woman who had opinions about everything and silences about other things. The woman who had been fighting for control her entire adult life and brought that same intensity into every room she walked into, including the ones where her children were trying to grow up. Chapter 2. A life built on fire, a home built on tension. Bette Davis was born Ruth Elizabeth Davis on April 5, 1908, in Lowell, Massachusetts. Her father left when she was 7 years old. Her mother, Ruthie, packed up the family and moved repeatedly, chasing work, chasing stability, chasing something that never quite arrived. Bette was educated at a series of schools. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She was the kind of person who became famous through sheer force of wanting it badly enough and refusing to stop. She arrived in Hollywood in 1930 with almost no money and no contacts. She got one contract, then another. She fought the studio over roles, over billing, over scripts. She was told repeatedly that she was not beautiful enough, not compliant enough, not easy enough to work with. None of that stopped her. By 1935, she had her first Oscar for Dangerous. By 1938, she had her second for Jezebel. By the early 1940s, she was the highest-paid woman in the United States. She had been married twice and divorced twice. She was running on coffee and cigarettes and a work ethic that frightened people who thought they worked hard. She was also, by 1947, pregnant for the second time. And then there was B.D. Chapter 3. The Child Inside the Spotlight. Barbara Davis Sherry was born on May 1st, 1947, in Santa Ana, California. She was Bette Davis's second child. Her father was William Grant Sherry, a painter and former Navy physical therapist who was Bette Davis's third husband. They had married in 1945. By the time B.D. was born, the marriage was already beginning to fracture. By 1950, it was over. The child who grew up watching her mother work. Dee came into a world that was, by any measure, extraordinary. The house in Los Angeles, the movie premieres, the names her mother knew. She would later say that she grew up surrounded by famous people the way other children grew up surrounded by neighbors. Joan Crawford was not a movie star to B.D. She was the woman she had seen at a party. Gary Merrill, who became Bette Davis's fourth husband in 1950, was simply the man who lived in the house. She was 3 years old when her mother married him. What B.D. would describe later was a childhood that looked one way from the outside and felt another way from the inside. The parties, the houses, the travel, the summers, but also the volatility, the unpredictability. The sense that her mother's emotional state was the weather and everyone else in the house was simply trying to read the sky. Bette Davis was not a quiet person. That was not a secret. Everyone who ever worked with her said so. She had opinions, and she expressed them. She had demands, and she made them. She was, by the accounts of directors, co-stars, and studio executives alike, a force that did not diminish because you were in a different room from her. What B.D. would eventually argue, in print, was that this same force operated at home, that the line between the woman on screen and the woman at the dinner table was not as clear as people imagined. Gary Merrill was in the house until 1960. Those 10 years were not easy. Ones, Merrill drank. There were arguments. There were separations. B.D. was 13 years old when the marriage officially ended. She had also, by that point, a younger sister. Michael Merrill had been born in 1952, and Margot Merrill in 1951, both adopted by Bette and Gary together. The household was, in other words, not a quiet one. B.D. grew up fast. She was, by the descriptions of people who knew the family, a serious child. Not academic in the traditional sense, but observant. She noticed things. She remembered things. She had her mother's jawline and her mother's direct gaze, and, as it turned out, her mother's willingness to say what she actually thought, even when no one wanted to hear it. Chapter 4. A Marriage at 17. She was 16 years old when she met Jeremy Hyman. Jeremy Hyman was the nephew of Elliot Hyman, a film producer who had significant business dealings with Bette Davis. He was 29 years old when he met B.D. That is not a small gap. He was 29. She was 16. They met in 1963. By 1964, when B.D. was just 17 years old, they were married. Bette Davis has said that she encouraged the marriage. There are multiple accounts suggesting she pushed for it. She said later that she thought Jeremy was good for her daughter, that she liked him, that she was happy to have him in the family. What is harder to say is how much a 17-year-old girl can make her own decisions about marriage when the most dominant person in her life is also the one telling her to go ahead. B.D. was 17 years old, Jeremy was 30, and Bette Davis gave her blessing. Chapter 5. Distance, faith, and a new identity. What happened next was that B.D. left. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the marriage to Jeremy Hyman took her out of her mother's orbit in a way that nothing else had managed. They moved. They built a life. In 1966, B.D. gave birth to a son, Ashley. 3 years later, a second son, Justin. B.D. was in her early 20s, living in Pennsylvania, raising 2 boys, and building something that looked, from the outside, like a quiet domestic life that had almost nothing to do with Hollywood. She and her mother remained in contact. Bette Davis visited. There were Christmases. There were phone calls. The relationship continued, and from the outside, it looked functional. B.D. appeared with her mother on talk shows. She was photographed at events. She wrote an affectionate preface to one of her mother's books. She was, publicly, a supportive daughter. And then came the faith. In the late 1970s, B.D. Hyman became a born-again Christian. This is not a small detail. It reshaped everything. It reshaped how she saw her past. It reshaped how she saw her mother. It gave her, by her own account, a framework for understanding what she believed she had experienced growing up. And it eventually gave her the language and the conviction to write it down. Chapter 6. The Book That Burned Everything. My Mother's Keeper was published in 1985. B.D. was 38 years old. The book is not a gentle memoir. It is a detailed account, scene by scene, conversation by conversation, of what B.D. describes as an emotionally abusive childhood. She writes about her mother's drinking, her mother's rages, her mother's cruelty to the people around her. She writes about specific incidents, specific words. She reconstructs dialogue from decades past with a confidence that many readers found either convincing or suspicious, depending on what they brought to the book themselves. She writes about being screamed at, about being manipulated, about her mother's behavior at family gatherings, on holidays, during visits. She writes about Jeremy being treated with contempt, about her sons being used as props in Bette Davis's emotional performances. She writes about a pattern of behavior that she characterizes, clearly and repeatedly, as abuse. The book came out while Bette Davis was still alive. Bette Davis was 77 years old when it was published. She had survived a stroke in 1983. She had survived a mastectomy. She was still working, still giving interviews, still the most recognizable version of herself. And now her daughter had written a book calling her a monster. The reaction was enormous. The press covered it for weeks. The tabloids ran with it. Talk shows debated it. People who had worked with Bette Davis lined up to defend her. People who had never met her lined up to believe B.D. The story of a famous mother and an unhappy daughter, told in the most public way possible, became one of the defining celebrity dramas of the mid-1980s. Chapter 7. A Mother's Final Rejection. Bette Davis did not stay quiet. She gave interviews. She called the book a work of fiction. She said she did not recognize herself in its pages. She said she had no idea where her daughter had gotten these stories. She expressed hurt and confusion and, underneath both of those, something that sounded very much like fury. She was a woman who had spent 50 years controlling her own narrative. She was a woman who had fought for every role, every credit, every line of dialogue, and now someone else was telling her story. And that someone was the person she had always said was the best thing she had ever done. She also, in at least one interview, said something that has stayed in the record. She said that she was cutting B.D. out of her will. She said it plainly. She said B.D. would get nothing. Bette Davis died on October 6, 1989. She was 81 years old. She died in Paris, at the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, of breast cancer. She had been traveling for work until very close to the end. She was, in those final months, still giving interviews, still appearing in public, still insisting on being Bette Davis. Dee did not attend the funeral. That sentence needs to sit by itself for a moment. The daughter did not attend the funeral, whatever had happened between them, whatever had been said in print and in private. The distance between B.D. Hyman and her mother in those final years was total. When Bette Davis died, B.D. was not there, and they had not spoken in years. Chapter 8. The Lives Left Behind. What happened after that is a story about what you do with the rest of your life when the central relationship in it has ended on those terms. B.D. Hyman, the daughter who wrote it down and then had to live in what came after. Jeremy Hyman, the man B.D. married at 17 and stayed married to, remained her husband. That is worth noting. In a story full of fractures and departures, the marriage that began when B.D. was still a teenager has, by all accounts, lasted. They remained in Pennsylvania. They remained committed to their faith. They built a community around it, a ministry of sorts. B.D. became involved in Christian outreach work. She wrote more books, all of them faith-based. None of them achieved the notoriety of My Mother's Keeper, but she kept writing. Ashley Hyman, B.D.'s elder son, was born in 1966. He grew up largely outside of the public eye. He has given very few interviews. He has not, to any significant degree, entered the conversation about his grandmother or his mother's book. He is the third generation of a family whose most famous member is also the source of its deepest wound, and he has chosen, largely, silence. Justin Hyman, the younger son, born in 1969, has similarly kept a low profile. He was an infant and then a toddler during the years that his grandmother was most famous, most powerful, and most present in his mother's life. He grew up knowing Bette Davis as a grandmother, and then, as the 1980s arrived and the book was written and the break happened, he grew up in the aftermath. What this family shared was a story that played out in public before any of them had the vocabulary to protect themselves from it. B.D. was a child when she became Bette Davis's daughter, as if that were a role she had been cast in rather than a person she had simply been born as. She was a teenager when she married. She was a young woman when she became a mother herself. And she was 38 years old when she decided that she had the right to tell her version of the childhood she had lived, regardless of what it cost. What it cost was everything: the relationship, the inheritance, the proximity to her mother's final years. She was not there when Bette Davis died. She was not mentioned in the final will. She had traded those things for the book. Whether it was worth it is not something anyone can answer from the outside. The truth is that both things can be true at the same time. B.D. can have experienced something real and painful and formative. And Bette Davis can have loved her daughter and also been capable of the kind of behavior that a person who grew up in it would need to write down. Those two things do not cancel each other out. They are both part of the same complicated story. Now consider the others who were close to Bette Davis and were also changed by proximity to her world. Michael Merrill, the son adopted by Bette and Gary in 1952. Michael Merrill was born in 1952. He was adopted as an infant by Bette Davis and Gary Merrill. He grew up in the same house as B.D., the same arguments, the same volatility, the same famous mother. And then he grew up to become, by all accounts, something remarkably steady. He became a lawyer. He worked in Boston. He stayed out of the public drama. When Bette Davis died, Michael was the executor of her estate. He was the one who organized the memorial, the one who spoke for the family in the aftermath. He was, in other words, the child who stayed. He also became the one tasked with managing his mother's legacy. In the years after her death, it was Michael who worked to protect and curate her image, who dealt with licensing requests and biographical projects, who kept the record as accurate as he could. He gave interviews occasionally. He spoke about his mother with what sounded like genuine affection, and also with the careful language of someone who had thought a lot about what to say and what not to say. He did not say much about BD, publicly. He did not need to. By every account, Michael Merrill became the version of the famous person's child who found a way to stay close without being consumed. He built a career completely separate from Hollywood. He loved his mother and stayed present with her, including in those final difficult years when Bette Davis was ill and the estrangement from BD had hardened into something permanent. He was there when she died. BD was not. And that difference tells you almost everything about the different choices these two people made in response to the same upbringing. Michael's story is one of loyalty sustained at the cost of complexity. Margot Merrill is the child whose story goes in the most different direction. Margot Merrill was also adopted by Bette Davis and Gary Merrill in 1951, a year before Michael. She was 1 year old at the time of her adoption. By the time she was a young child, it became clear that she had significant developmental challenges. She was eventually diagnosed with what was then described as brain damage, likely resulting from birth complications. She required specialized care that could not be provided at home. Bette Davis placed Margot in the Laughlin School in Geneva, New York. That is the fact, stated plainly. A residential school for children with developmental disabilities. Margot went to live there when she was still a small child, and she has lived there ever since. She is in her 70s now. She has spent the majority of her life at Laughlin. She has not, to any meaningful degree, been a public figure. She has not given interviews. She has not been part of the story in any active way. What she has been is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. Bette Davis paid for Margot's care for the rest of her life. After her death, the estate continued that provision. Michael Merrill has overseen it. The care has continued. That is the practical fact. The emotional fact, which nobody has a clean answer to, is what it means to place a child in a residential school when she is still very young, and what that child's experience of family has been over the course of a lifetime. Margot Merrill has been there for more than 60 years. She was placed there when she was perhaps 6 or 7 years old. She is in her 70s now. The world knows Bette Davis for the performances, for the eyes, for the voice, for Margot Channing and Baby Jane and Judith Traherne. Very few people in that audience know that there was a child named Margot who grew up in a school in upstate New York and who bears, in name at least, a version of one of those characters. The name Margot was given before anyone knew about the challenges she would face. But the echo of it sits there in the record, and it is not comfortable. Margot's story is the one that asks the hardest questions and provides the fewest answers. Now take all of these people together and look at what they share. They all grew up in the gravitational field of one of the most powerful women Hollywood ever produced. A woman who had fought her way to the top from nothing, who had genuinely changed what was possible for women in the film industry, who had a presence that filled rooms and careers and decades. A woman who was also, by every honest account, extremely difficult to live with. Not because she was evil, not because she was a monster, whatever BD's book implied, but because the same qualities that made her a great actress, the intensity, the conviction, the refusal to back down, the absolute certainty that she was right, those qualities do not become soft and manageable when you walk through a front door. For B.D., the answer was to write it down and publish it, and lose her mother, and stand by what she had said. For Michael, the answer was to build a separate life, and then come back and stay and be the one who was there. For Margot, there was no answer in that sense. There was a life lived largely in private, cared for, provided for, but at a distance from the story that everyone else was living. And for the two grandsons, Ashley and Justin, the answer has been silence, a deliberate, sustained quiet that has lasted decades and shows no sign of breaking. What they all share is this. None of them chose the situation they were born into. None of them asked to be connected to that specific woman, that specific fame, that specific set of contradictions. They were simply there. And each of them, in their own way, has had to find out what it means to build a life when the person who shaped you most is also the person the entire world has an opinion about. B. D wrote the book, and the book is still in print. You can buy it now, 40 years after it was published, and read her version of the childhood. Bette Davis's version is also available. In the 2 memoirs she wrote and the hundreds of interviews she gave, both versions are out there. Neither one is the whole truth. Both of them are somebody's truth. There is a small detail that has stayed with people who covered Bette Davis in her final years. In 1988, 1 year before she died, she was on a talk show. She was asked about BD. She paused. She looked down for a moment, just a moment, and then she looked back up and said that she didn't know why her daughter had done what she did. She said she had always loved her, and then she changed the subject. She moved on to something else with that speed and efficiency that she had always been famous for, the ability to pivot, to not let a camera catch her for too long in a moment she hadn't planned. But it was there. 1 second, maybe 2. A woman who had controlled every performance of her entire life, sitting in front of a camera and not quite being able to control this one. She was 80 years old. Her daughter was not speaking to her. The book was 3 years old and still on shelves and still being talked about, and she had 2 or 3 seconds where the mask did not hold. That is what the story looks like from the inside. Not the awards, not the headlines, not the legend. 2 seconds on a talk show in 1988. A woman looking down and then looking back up. The world has always told the story of Bette Davis in a certain way. The fights with the studio, the roles, the marriages, the feud with Joan Crawford, the voice, the eyes. The whole enormous performance of being Bette Davis that she maintained for 60 years without ever quite breaking character. That story is real, and it is worth knowing, and it will keep being told for as long as people care about cinema. But the story of what it was like to grow up next to all of that, to be the child in that house, to be the person who had to find out who you were when the most famous person in your world had already decided who everyone in her orbit was supposed to be, that is the one worth sitting with. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.